Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Carl Carlson.
And this is Fred Schenkelberg. Hey, Carl, I got this. I saw a question that went to you the other day. I got copied on it. And I was like, I got to follow this one because I have no idea what she was talking about.
Yes, it was a great question. And that went to both of us. And which the kind of questions we love because it stimulates discussion. So we had some fantastic back and forth emails with the contributor. And it had to do with NUDD and FMEA, which we'll have to explain what that means.
Yeah. So what is this FMEA thing anyway? Do you know anybody that wrote a book on that?
Never heard of FMEA. And so and part of the problem is the listener who wrote us didn't really have a strong background in NUDD, NUDD. Just had heard of it, saw that it was being done, but was being asked by her management whether maybe it could replace FMEA. And go, wow, that's an interesting subject.
Okay.
In a subject that maybe a lot of people don't know about. I bet a lot of our listeners do. We'll see.
Well, you got to back up a little bit because I don't even remember if it's an acronym or if it's a word in itself.
Well, I'll explain what the acronym is to start with. New is N is new. U is unique to the industry. D is different from some past item, and D is difficult. So different and difficult reliability. In other words, it's the second D has to do with the degree of difficulty.
Okay.
So if you're a diver, you have a certain degree of difficulty, that kind of thing. Well, this particular item you're assessing, and NUDD is used to assess, I'll call it preliminary risk regarding a set of items or features.
I've heard of I don't think it had a name when I ran into it. We called it red flags. And that might have been what its name was, or it was just what we called it. It was basically, you're going to do something new. All right, we got to check that out. You're going to do something unique. It's an invention that we're putting in this thing. No, we got to check that out. It was a flag to the quality, reliability, manufacturing teams to go, all right, do we know how to deal with this thing? Do we know how to make it stable? What's its variability? It was a risk signal. But now it's got a name. That's everything evolves, I guess.
It does have a name. And in my consulting practice, I've run across many companies that use some kind of NUDD process. When they're coming out with a new widget, they say, let's NUDD it.
They do. They actually say that.
Yes.
Okay. Now I've heard of it as, like in change management does this pose a risk? And then it was like a checklist. Have we done this before or not? And it went that's the way I've commonly seen it.
Well, and that's probably the way I support that. That's a great concept. You understand the principle involved. And there's nothing, in my opinion, that is constrained about whether you limit to the NUDD.
Oh, yeah.
For example.
Somebody probably has a 6-letter version of this.
Exactly. Or maybe a 3-letter.
Yeah.
And so I've always used a company-specific criteria. And I brainstorm that criteria with the project team or with the company overall. And we say, okay, what criteria do we want to use to decide, in the case of FMEA, which FMEAs we're going to do? Yeah. We can't do FMEAs on everything. We don't have the resources, the money.
And it's not useful either.
Yeah. And so I call it preliminary risk assessment. And it's in chapter 4 of my book. So it's in there, which describes how to do it. And what you come away with is your prioritized list of FMEAs. And you can decide which ones you do.
Well, that sounds like something NUDD, it would be a good framework to use to identify that. Yet I can see a long discussion in most of the teams I've ever worked with, well, what do we call new? One guy's, I've been working with those in this other company, 30 years. That's not new to me. It's a piece of cake. And the rest of the engineers have never seen that technology before. And it's new, and how new is too new that we have to deal with it.
You're right on the money. And that's, again, you understand the principles. And so when I do it, I don't use a binary, it's new or not new.
Mm-hmm.
I use a scale, like a red, yellow, green.
Okay.
1 to 5 or something,
Yeah.
and degree of newness, because it could be a little bit new, a lot new, like you say. And that way the team can say, you know what, this is brand new. We've never done it before. It's new technology to us. And I don't even use the term new. I'll put one of my criteria is degree of new technology.
Mm-hmm.
And because that then hits, whereas you could say degree of new design. So there's a lot of aspects to this, but the NUDD, the whole concept of NUDD is to differentiate risk going into a project, like which features or which items in the system hierarchy or which processes are most risky that we need to focus our tools on. And then some companies, and here's where it got tricky with the back and forth on the emails with the listener, is that some companies take the NUDD and they go further. They say, okay, here's the list of risky items from the NUDD process. Now, what are we doing to make sure that that risk is addressed? So they'll have a separate column or columns next to it.
So an action item, much like you would do in an FMEA for the high hitting stuff, you'd say, all right, we got to deal with this safety issue, and here's what our plan is. That makes sense.
Yes.
And I've seen it in organizations where they would be done pretty early in the product development process, in the concept phase, really. And they say, all right, well, and I ran into it. I was, one of the early accelerated tests I ever ran and designed and ran was based on, we were going to use ball grid arrays, which were a relatively new technology. They've been used in servers and high-end electronics, in expensive electronics, but they weren't used in consumer electronics. And it was the first time that our design team was going to use one of these things. And so it got a whole lot of action items from a whole bunch of people. And I was part of, well, how do we actually lay this out on a board? How long will the solder joints last? We spent months examining it and testing it. And I looked at so many X-ray images of balls of solder joints. I saw them in my sleep. I still do. But it was a part of that process was, we've never used this package before. And the team actually thought it was enough of a risk that they had two paths. One with the traditional Gullwing leads, the leaded is the right term, package that we'd use for ASICs for decades, and a different design using the new package with the ball grid arrays, which had advantages. And it turned out to be a very solid technology. And at the time, we didn't know. And the folks that used it at high end typically put it into sockets, and we were going to solder it down. And so they were like, okay, this is different. It hit all four of those acronyms. We didn't know how difficult it was. We'd never done it before. We can't see the leads. We don't know if they're soldered or not. How do we know? It ticked all the boxes going, we're going to put a lot of money into understanding this.
Yeah. So you could imagine for listeners, you could imagine if you have a system hierarchy in one set of columns, and then next to it, I'm just outlining the visual for the NUDD. Mm-hmm. Next to it, you have a column for new, a column for unique, a column for different, a column for difficult. And then you put in there, an X if it's whatever, or if it's a variable, if you want to do a red, yellow, green.
Score it, yeah. Or you could score it like you do rank it.
Yeah, score it and rank it. And then next to that, you could have specific columns that integrate those together. Like if it is new and unique and different and difficult, that would be higher than if it's just one of them.
Right.
And you could do some, and then you could have next to that some type of action. I'm just stating that you can make this visible and use that type of front end process. But then I'm thinking, to answer the listener's question, is would it replace an FMEA? And I have a resounding no on that. It just does not. And it omits things like root cause. It omits the differentiation between severity and occurrence, and which is really important, I think. And that's inherent in risk management, is severity and occurrence. And so it misses key things that are essential in an FMEA. And so I would caution anyone against using a NUD process instead of FMEA. But I would say, yes, by all means, it can be a front end to identify where you focus your efforts. So when you do an FMEA, it's focused on the most important areas.
Well, it's also, I see the NUD process is it misses the things that you're already doing, you're familiar with, right? And all these other good stuff. But one of the criteria that's not on there, I mean, the difficult part might be a catch-all if it's done properly, but it's like we're switching vendors for a discrete component and it's considered a commodity.
Yeah.
That won't rank very well on a NUD scoring as risk. Yet an experienced procurement engineer in folks that have seen, well, it's the same form, fit, and function argument one too many times, will know that proposes a risk. And an FMEA going down it is, well, the package is different. All right, we're doing a process FMEA. How is this package different enough that we can't assemble it? Or we have to do special tooling or take some other activity. And so NUD might catch stuff like that, but it would be so deep in the weeds that
right.
And there's not a lot of brainstorming about the effects in NUD. It's
right.
It might be new, but it might be fantastic. It's not that it's a bad new. It might have unknowns. I think FMEA is good at doing that too. But I look at NUD in the way you're describing it is it's looking at where do we need to go look.
Yeah, it's preliminary. Where do we need to go look is different than what is the risk related to where you're going to look. To me, they go step one and step two. The preliminary, like you're describing, Fred, is where do you go look? And then there's a process of looking.
Yeah. I also look at NUD as it for the design team. I've seen it used where we've got a new CAD program. Our license switched from one company to another. What's the part of the risk of that being new is the learning curve to get up to speed. And what if it delays the program? We're going to make a brand new product for the market, and the risk is they don't want it. What are we going to do about that? There's stuff like that I've seen these go into, and it's not the design specific or process specific. It's much higher level is where I've seen it often used.
Well, and let me build on something you said a few minutes ago that related to the weeds and basically the noise. Take a case study on General Motors a few years ago had the ignition problem. That was basically a change that was made related to a supplier on a system that was already well designed and tested, the ignition system. It was not it wouldn't not have shown up, I don't think, on a NUD analysis.
No.
Because it was not new, it was not unique. There was a small thing that was different that the supplier did, but it wouldn't have shown up high on any of those columns. And so I'm very concerned that we would replace the front end of how do you know where to look only with NUD. I think NUD is a great way to sift out the biggest issues but there are other things that need follow-up, such as a supplier change.
Yeah. I also look at it as if it's electronics, you always do an FMEA with the power supply.
Yeah, right.
Power supply, fans,
Inverter.
Inverter. Yeah. If it's got one of those, you just got to pay attention to it. It's just a given.
And let me explain something else, which is just huge, that people that want to replace tools should be aware of. And that's that more than half the problems occur at interfaces. And so if you take a look at item 1 through 10, and you say, okay, here's a NUD for item 1 through 10. But the interface between item 2 and 4 is a big issue. You might not catch that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And what's the typical team members in NUDs from your experience?
There's no typical on this. It might be a few people. It might be a project team. It could be the FMEA team before they've started.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the other comment, and thanks for bringing that up, it reminded me, is there's no standard. There's no standard NUD process that I'm aware of. There's a lot of, if you go internet search, you'll see some in the public domain, some papers by, an Amazon case study, some other case studies, there's some presentations there. I personally have seen a number of company-specific standards describing NUD process, but they're proprietary.
Yeah.
So I'm not aware of anything that's universally agreed upon as to what it is.
Yeah, it's a concept of a tool, or it's an idea. Yeah, I think it's pretty universal, independent of whether it's called NUD or not. It's I always call it red flags. That's what I call it. And when presented with a problem and somebody walks in with a solution, we almost intuitively go through a NUD type checklist of some sort to go, do we know how to deal with this?
Right. It's a great way of thinking. How new is something? How unique is it? Have we ever done this before? I mean, it's a great way of thinking, and it should be part of the thinking process that goes in. I'm always a little worried when people formalize something and then think the formality takes the place of the thinking.
Yeah.
We'll just do the checklist.
And that's kind of, I biting my tongue a little bit, is like, standards, and standards around FMEA have in some cases made it kind of a less than useful tool if you just strictly follow the standard. Thou shalt always use the scale, and here's the 1 in 10, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 for occurrence rankings, and on and on and on. And I'm like, you're really missing the concept here. And I think that's the key part. I think it's something that, even though I'd never heard of NUDD as a tool name or a method, I've seen it. I've participated in it and been a part of the action item coming out of one of those kinds of assessments. It's a valuable way to think, and that might be a whole other podcast. Is how do you go about adopting a new tool or substituting tools and stuff like that? As I always think of it as, well, what's the input? What's the output? And, and in the middle of it is the method. And most of the tools, and we have a long list in the book that we did of methods that have their own peculiar inputs and outputs and connections to other tools and feeding into other activities, and typically triggers for when this tool is appropriate, and other times when this tool is, it's the wrong thing to do. So if you're looking at high level, where do we need to go focus some more engineering time? Well, that seems to be a pretty darn good tool to get you going. And one of its connections is into FMEA, is give you that pre-risk assessment.
You're bringing up a topic, and this always happens in our podcast. It's a lot of fun, which is another podcast. And the topic would be something like this, which is reliability as a way of thinking. It's not just a set of methods.
Yeah, we'll have to work on that title, that.
Got to work on the title. And get that down to 3 words.
That's right.
And but the point is, like, take FMEA. FMEA is a thinking method. It's a way of looking at things. It's not a fill out the form.
Yeah, no, I describe it as an organized brainstorm. It gives you a structure to follow. It's very adaptable and thus requiring you to think.
But this conversation goes beyond any one tool.
Yeah.
In other words, a NUDD process isn't going to do anything by itself. It's the thinking that goes along with it. It's the deliberation. It's the principles of Pareto and narrowing down where you focus. Those are principles. And if you can use a NUDD process to do that, a red flag process to do that, you can come up with a dozen other names, but the principle is the same. We can't focus on everything. We have to narrow down, and there are ways to do that. And that's the way of thinking. But I worry about people that are too focused on the method or the form, fill out the form and we'll get the process done, get the checklist done, as opposed to actually understand the principles and go forward that way.
Yeah. Well, one of the thoughts is that a good amount of things NUDD focuses on it doesn't catch everything. And like, for example, if we have a bunch of field history on a family of products, like your GM deal, you have a particular brand of car or style of car, and you got all of this wonderful information about what works and what doesn't work. And that's the Pareto is the one that triggered it. Well, that's not new. It's not unique. It might be difficult, maybe, if you look at it, but I have not seen people look at historical data as an input into the red flag processes, I would call it. That's a separate tool. We look at our field history as another input into what do we need to focus on. And, those two, and there might be 2 or 3 other things that a good team will analyze and to say, all right, we need to allocate resources to go solve these things, but there's multiple methods that we use to get there. And NUDD is not the catch-all be-all. And what I was concerned about is that somebody will come up with an 8-letter acronym that, is NFUMEA,
right.
Mush them together. And I think then lose the value of either one of them.
Exactly. It's a process that's important. And I always consider those criteria that you're talking about to be configurable by the project team. So they can say, we really want to look at past field history as one of the criteria for selecting the next project. And that's appropriate if the team wants to use that criteria.
Yep.
So,
yeah. And there's all kinds of variants of that. Yeah. Next week, we'll pick another 4-letter acronym and take it apart,
Exactly. Well, if you're a listener and you raise your hand if you've used a NUDD process and let us know. We'd love to hear from you and how it's worked, where you think it fits into reliability, that kind of thing. Yeah. How would they go about that, Fred?
Someday you're going to catch on to this.
Exactly.
So you can head over to accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. There's a couple of ways you can get in touch with us there. And Carl and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages. So plenty of ways to get in touch with us. Nothing new, unique, or what's the other D? Difficult. I already forgot what the other D was.
SpeakPipe.
Oh, no. I'm thinking there's nothing NUDD about our process to get in touch with us.
New, unique, different, and difficult.
Different and difficult. Yeah. We give you as many options as it works. I don't monitor X much at all, so that's not a good one. But so anyway, thanks, Carl. I'm glad you sparked that question from one of our listeners and regulars. And I did see a bunch of the info going back and forth, so hopefully they got the idea. And
I hope she's able to present that at a conference someplace or come on in some way, maybe join us on a discussion once she's got it all figured out.
Yeah, no, that would be awesome. All right, cool. Thanks so much, Carl. We'll talk to you again.
See you later, Fred.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.